Here we are. Good evening, everyone. I'm honoured to be the guest lecturer for the Brock Lecture. It's a great honour and very surprising to me because I should begin with a disclaimer. I'm not a historian, although I did major in history for my BA. My main occupation, as was said in the introduction, has been as a writer of drama, often of historical figures such as Percy Granger and Errol Flynn and Don Dunstan. So my interest in Frank Rees George is primarily because he's my great uncle, whose tragic but active life has been a part of family legend. Much of what we know about Frank and his family comes from a large collection of letters that came from the family's house in Lockleys after a great-grandmother died in the 1920s. Along with some furniture and painting of another ancestor, who I assume was great-great-great-grandfather John George, and other documents were kept in a rough wooden box. As my father, Frank Rees George III, was a bank manager, the box of letters was carted around rural Australia for many decades. I remember it being in the back toilet of our house in Yorktown, and I would occasionally delve into it for reading matter. But the letters were difficult to decipher, and there were many of them. There were also several diaries belonging to Frank Rees George I, detailing his work as an engineer on various public projects throughout the state. It was all pretty dull stuff for a 12-year-old, although there was one letter from a camel driver to our great-grandmother that was particularly memorable. And that letter is the main subject of the video that I'll show later in the speech. Born in Adelaide in 1874 to a middle-class family, Frank's father was an engineer and builder responsible for, among others, the first railway bridge at Murray Bridge. We think, there's the photo, don't look too closely, and we think that's probably Frank George there because he's the best dressed one amongst the workers. His mother, formerly Editor Leonora Catchlove, but known to everyone as Nora, was from a family who had been amongst the first arrivals in the colony. The Catchloves were involved with brewing and pubs, while one of Editor's brothers had the unlikely name of Edward Napoleon Bonaparte Catchlove. He was a police trooper and worked to the north of the state. Frank's grandmother, Nancy, was a teacher who ran a small, unprofitable, it would seem, school from her home in West Terrace. There are numerous letters from Nancy to her son, Frank, asking for money and giving updates on her students. She complains about late payers and about one boy whose farts made it difficult to continue teaching him. And there's a series of letters from Frank Sr. to a suitor for his sister's hand. Frank, as the senior man in the family, had the final say, and much to his sister's annoyance, he disapproved of her beau. Adelaide in the 19th century was an interesting place. The term City of Churches was apt then, but the strong non-conformist congregations added a particular flavour to Adelaide's religious life. There was an interest in science and philosophy, and there was a lively scientific community dominated, it would seem, by Charles Todd. Todd is best known, as I'm sure you know, as the energy behind the construction of the overland telegraph, and who, through his use of weather readings telegraphed into him from around the state, is credited with creating the concept of isodars to reflect weather gradients. There's an early example of the weather bars. This is West Terrace, 1883. So, because he was a great proponent of the telegraph, and he set up telegraph connections throughout the state and had that information telegraphed to him. I think he was the first person to realise he put all that together. He got an isobar, which he called. Also in Adelaide was the mathematician and physicist William Bragg, who was a very early developer of X-rays and wireless communications, who, with his son Lawrence, won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1916, the only father-son team to do so. Bragg married Todd's daughter, so the families were closely linked. And Nancy George taught the Todd children. Here's a short quote from one of Nancy's letters to her son, Frank Sr. August the 4th, 1875. My dear Nora and Frank, Ediver was called Nora. I can't imagine why. Wouldn't lump yourself with the name Ediva. We had an auntie whose name was Ediva Madge, but she only ever called herself Madge. Rejoice with me, Madge, that's Madeline Rees George, and Bibbs, Marion Rees George, two sisters, arrived here safely last night, quite well and jolly they are, not altered, but just like they were in England. They just arrived by boat. I think Mrs. Todd will be here to see them tomorrow. She is very anxious the boys and Miss Todd should begin their French lessons. Lots of kisses to dear little Frank, your affectionate mother, Nancy F. George. And to continue the sense of how small the community was, my maternal grandfather, that's him there, Edward Bromley, took over from Charles Todd when he retired. So despite Frank Rees George Sr. behaving very conventionally for the times in his dealings with one sister's relationships, another sister, Madeline, is a very active proponent of high-quality education for girls and plays a key role in the foundation of the Advanced School for Girls, where she becomes headmistress, and her younger sister, Marion, known as Bibbs, also teaches at the school. That's the first Advanced School for Girls there. I'm not sure exactly where it was. In her obituary, the Advertiser and Register recorded, during her time as headmistress, she trained most of the women who afterwards became leaders of their professions in South Australia. For the first time, girls were educated as thoroughly as boys. And that's the obit in the Advertiser. Interestingly, the only letter we have from Madeline lists her address as Curry Street, Adelaide, which is curious to me because the northwest corner of the city was notoriously poverty-stricken at this time. The West End slums were considered the worst in Australia. It was here that Mary MacKillop came to prominence, providing assistance to the destitute in the area. The streets and laneways around Light Square, which is adjacent to Curry Street, were notorious for prostitution, gambling and drunkenness. Boddington's Row was the most infamous, and if the young women couldn't find a bed there, they carried on their trade at the Willows, in other words, the banks of the Torrens. Great-aunt Madeline must have been living almost cheek by jowl with these poor desperates. There's the only photo I could find of the slums of Adelaide around that period. Just up the road at the Theatre Royal in Hindley Street, the back bar of the venue was referred to as the saddling paddock, where a young chap could get a ride for the night with a filly of presumably more refined quality than ones at the Willows. As Patricia Summerling, the historian, describes, life was particularly difficult for young single mothers, widows, deserted wives, and even for many mothers with working spouses. They survived as best they could, taking in washing, working in nearby factories, looking after other mothers' children, or resorting to prostitution. Now Nancy, our great-grandmother, struggles to pay the rent and is reliant on her sons for additional income, but though difficult, it is nothing compared with her unfortunate neighbours. Life for her revolves around going to the theatre and looking after her grandchildren and keeping her small school operating. But death is always close at hand. Frank and Nora had 8 children. Rosa Annie died in Auburn at the age of 3. Nellie Madeline died aged 12. Harriet Augustus at 18 months. Cecil and Spencer died in infancy in 1889. Only 3 children out of the 8 survived, despite the family being educated and middle class. Frank Rees, of the 3 survivors, Frank Rees, my grandfather, Frederick John, and Albert Ernest, known to everyone as Uncle Dick. Frank Rees George dies at 48, and Ediva, or Nora, later remarried and had 3 more children to Sam Keller. So 11 in all, not a bad number. Didn't make the dozen though. Frank George at some stage lived in East Adelaide, on the other side of town, well, very close to where we are now. And we're a much more middle class and genteel existence for everybody. I don't know if you can see that. A brass band, ladies out playing on their bikes, and of course cricket. Tennis parties, cricket games, cycling for ladies. It was a different world from the slums of the West End. As young Frank was a student at St Peter's, we can assume that this was the environment he grew up in. And then after school, he studied at the School of Mines. This is a time when the search for mining wealth dominated the lives of many. For no good reason, I get the impression that prospecting and mining was the cool thing to do for bright, ambitious young men of his time. Just as in my generation, the cool dudes formed rock and roll bands or made films, and in contemporary times, they make apps or design social media sites, doing what young people always do: test boundaries, seek challenges, explore their world. Frank was a more conventional explorer, but he was on a quest for knowledge, seeking to get to know the unknown interior of the colony, searching for the mineral wealth that had, to this point, except for copper, largely eluded South Australia. I've come across several newspaper references to Frank from 1899 onwards. When he was sent to Tarcoola, there's the Tarcoola police station, and other places as a surveyor to mark out mining claims. In the Evening Journal, July 1899, Warturpa, which I gather is near Arkaroola. Mr. George, surveyor, has arrived here and issued miner's rights. The whole of his supply of forms has vanished within hours. Mr. George is now fixing the points to the goldfields boundary. And another one, actually was that one there? Another one from the Adelaide Observer a couple of months later. Mr. F.R. George, the warden's assistant, came here from Warturpa on September to take levels on the site selected for the concentrating plant. And finally this one from Port Augusta, 1900. Mr. George, acting warden, accompanied by Mr. King and others, made a trip to Kitchery last week to fix boundaries of a water reserve. Now, these are not particularly dramatic references, it's just they exist, that's all. But the writer of the last one I thought had an amusing anecdote. Quote, "There was a lively meeting at Gilligan's on Tuesday night. They say that 6 different managers and 1 squatter completely lost their several and collective tempers, and the scene was for some time reminiscent of the New South Wales House of Assembly." So nothing much changes. Now, the first mention I came across of Frank George is in the minutes or a report on a meeting of this very august body, the Royal Geographical Society of South Australia, at its meeting on May the 6th, 1899. The meeting concluded with, quote, "An enjoyable vocal and instrumental music and recitations was contributed by Messrs. W. Barr, F.R. George and several others." So, showbiz runs deep in the George DNA. Frank George is involved in 2 more expeditions early in the new century. In 1903 he was second in command of the Wells expedition to Central Australia. This trip was notable as it was the first major expedition that Herbert Bazadow participated in. Bazadow was to become one of the state's foremost figures in anthropology, botany and politics. The Australian Dictionary biography notes that for more than 25 years Bazadow's working life was characterised by major geological, exploratory and medical relief expeditions to Central and Northern Australia. Also on the Wells expedition was the camel driver George Edgington and 3 Aboriginal assistants, a Reriki known as Punch and his wife Unruba or Annie, and a young girl Midgegodoni known as Lady. Bazadow kept a photographic record of the trip and may have trained Frank George, as Frank also took photographs on his last expedition. In 1904, Frank George led an expedition north from Fowler's Bay from June to November to explore territory north of the Nullarbor Plains. Despite following up on promising reports of gold, Frank found nothing. But in an interview with the Advertiser in November, he concluded, "My trip has been practically resultless, except in a negative sense. There is no need for anyone to go out there looking for gold, as there is no mineral in the country. The rest of the country is as dry and bad as any in South Australia. It is barren and useless. Even the Aboriginals have left it, and the only animals we saw were rabbits and dingoes." Then in 1905, this report appears in the Advertiser, August 24, 1905. The government decided to send Mr. F.R. George with a party to explore and prospect the western strip of the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory was at this stage under the control of South Australia. The expedition will leave Oodnadatta early next month and proceed by the north side of the Musgrave Ranges to the Peterman Ranges to examine the latter for gold and other metals and minerals. Mr. George will make a thorough examination and then proceed north and northeast to the Trua Range. The main object of the expedition is to prospect the country in the vicinity of the Tanami Rockhole to the east of the telegraph line. Mr. George's party will be away about 12 months, and it is probable that it will not be devoid of danger. On a previous expedition, 7 of their camels were poisoned by eating a plant called gastrolobium. Besides this danger, the blacks are very troublesome in the Petermann Ranges. 2 parties were driven back from there a few months ago. Mr. George, the leader of the party, is a capable officer and one in whom is reposed the entire faith of the government. He has considerable bush experience. The camel driver is Mr. George Edgington, who is regarded as one of the best men with camels in the state. And that brings me to the video. It's always been wonderfully impressive, that beautifully written letter by a camel driver. I mean, so much of what we remember of, or what is important in history often, is the literature that goes with it. And there's wonderful literature coming from an uneducated person, but writing from the heart and writing beautifully. So, we're nearly finished. There were many obituaries for Frank in papers throughout the country. The Advertiser reported, that's that one there, a first telegram from Mr. Bradshaw, the telegraph station master, merely reported the death of Mr. George 5 miles out of Alice Springs. But a second message from Constable McLeod mentioned that Mr. George had suffered from dysentery. The third telegram from Dr. Ewings the following day gave the following information. Frank George died early this morning. He had been ailing since Monday with diarrhoea principally. Frank Wallace and self saw him last evening. We suspected nothing serious. He said he would come to stay at the hotel this morning as he required nourishing food. The Honourable Lachlan said, the Minister for Crown Lands said, I had the very highest opinion of Mr. George, not only since I have been in office, but this time, but previously. The government geologist expressed deep regret. His removal will be a distinct loss to the public service. He was always trustworthy and energetic and full of pluck. His reports were thoroughly reliable. George Edgington gets a mention in the Royal Commission on Aborigines in 1916. And to quote from it, it is interesting to note that when Edgington was asked, do you know of any instances where white men have interfered with the native women? He answered, no. They marry amongst themselves and there are no illegitimate children. Edgington himself, it goes on, had had a child, Rufus, by Susie Wilton in 1910. And I remember somewhere else reading that George's grandson actually is quite a leader within the Andiamatana community and was quite a powerful figure. As a postscript, my father, Frank Rees George III, must have written to George Edgington in 1955, and he received this reply on behalf of George from the superintendent, Walter Curtis, of the Old Timers' Home in the Alice where George was residing. So another less distressing letter from the Alice involving George Edgington. I'm writing this on behalf of George Edgington, who on the 27th of July was 88 years of age. And as his sight is failing, I am or will endeavour to tell you how pleased he was to receive your welcome letter. I would have liked you to have heard his comments when I was reading your letter over to him. He has a remarkable memory, and I do not know if you are aware that Frank Clune, the author, is writing a book on Frank Rees George. And he interviewed George concerning the trek they made out into the Western Australian border when George was the leading camel man for the late Frank Rees George's exploration of that uninhabited, I should say, by white people. uninhabited country by white people. He, Frank Clune, sent along to George a number of his books. Mrs. Curtis and myself were both very pleased when we saw this dear old man's face light up when I read out to him your kind words of expression at the close of your letter. So there we have it, the story of one life that inevitably intertwines with many others. Thank you so much for inviting me to share the story of Frank Rees George II with you. I trust it's been of interest, even if the visuals have been a bit limited. Thank you.